All right, SUP equipment. Let's talk about paddles. So in the paddles, first thing that we'll look at is the parts of the paddle. So this is the blade, the paddle blade. We have the paddle shaft, and we have the paddle handle, also quite often called the T-grip. And this one you can kind of see is almost shaped like a T, and that's where the name comes from. This particular paddle is a three-piece paddle. So 3 pieces is quite often what we'll get with an inflatable, so that it'll go into 3 different pieces to fit in the bag. So the 3 pieces are the handle and middle shaft comes in half. That fits in the bag and goes with the inflatable. So if you're traveling with it, everything's contained nice inside the bag. So we have 3 pieces. Paddles also come in 2 pieces and fixed. 2-piece paddle, this one here. No middle adjustment, just has this top piece. 2 pieces. So 3-piece folds up nice and tight. 2-piece is really just to get that adjustment aspect out of the paddle. So by adjustment, what I mean is the paddle handle height, or the paddle height, can be adjusted for different size paddlers. Last style is a fixed paddle. It's 1 piece, so this is a fixed paddle. We have the blade, we have the shaft, we have a handle. There's no adjustment pieces. This paddle started this long. I cut it to the length that I wanted, glued the handle back in, and now I have a paddle that is always going to be this height. So we've talked about parts of the paddle and different styles of paddles, as in 3-piece, 2-piece, 1-piece. We also have paddle construction that we can look at. Different paddles will be made out of different materials. Quite often, the more affordable paddle boards that we see potentially on Amazon, the paddles that come with them often are made out of aluminum. They'll have a plastic blade, aluminum shaft. They still might be 3 pieces, and then a plastic handle. Generally, those are going to be pretty heavy and not last as long. Up from aluminum, we might find fiberglass. Fiberglass is going to be fairly durable. Be a little bit lighter than aluminum, and quite often it'll be plastic blade, or a poly blade they call it, fiberglass shaft, and then probably a plastic handle. So when we go to fiberglass, we lose some of the weight, we don't lose durability, and we get a little bit nicer paddle usually. One up from that again is going to be carbon fiber. So this is a carbon fiber paddle, carbon fiber blade, carbon fiber shaft, carbon fiber handle. Carbon fiber gives us a lot of rigidity with less weight. So the benefit of going to a carbon fiber paddle generally is we're saving on weight. The lighter the paddle, the less work on our shoulders, and we can stay out paddling longer. Other considerations for paddles are the paddle blade size. This one here, you won't be able to read it, but it says 86. 86 cubic centimeters is the overall size. Paddle blade sizes used to be like over 100, and then they dropped to 95, and now typically we're looking at 86. 100 cubic centimeters gives lots of blade size and it moves lots of water, but it's a ton of work on our shoulders. And even the racers were having injuries, so paddle blades had to get smaller. For recreational paddlers, because quite often we're not intentionally building up and strengthening our shoulders all the time, we needed a bit of a smaller blade again. So very typically you're going to see 86, and maybe for a youth paddle it might be 76. So we just want to keep an eye on that. If you have a paddle blade, this one for example, it doesn't say the actual size on it, but I can tell by looking at it, it's a bigger size. This is probably about a 95. Benefit of 95, we're going to move more water, potentially get more power. Disadvantages, it's going to be a lot more work on our shoulders. Other things to look at, we have a funny angle on the paddle blade. So if I have this paddle shaft sticking straight up in the air, you can see that angle here, how that blade is angled. Typically, it's 10 degrees, and that's a good general purpose angle that you're going to find on most paddles. When we start looking at holding the paddle, we need to make sure that angle is facing away from us. So for me to hold this paddle correctly, I'm going to have a hand on the top when I'm standing, and I'm going to be holding it up like this, so that angle is angling away from me. What I don't want to do is be holding it like this. So often I'll see people out paddling like this. I know they haven't taken a lesson or they haven't watched enough YouTube videos, because intuitively I think we want to scoop the water, but the reality is that to get an efficient stroke, the angle needs to be facing away from us. And the reason for that is as that blade comes into the water, you can see how that angle in the blade starts lining up. So it's almost facing directly in the water. So as I'm pushing through my power phase, moving through the water, that blade is pushing flat onto the water. Earlier when I talked about, or later when I talk about stroke, when we're looking at the ideas model, we're going to talk about this blade should be taken out of the water at the feet. The reason for that is once I pass the feet, you see that angle of the blade, it starts moving or tipping up towards the water. I'm losing efficiency, and we don't want to be working inefficient. So as soon as that blade is at the foot, we take it out and put it in again. So we're always pushing directly on the water to get power. So that's how we hold the paddle. So angle faces away. We can either use that angle as a reference, or if I'm hanging onto the handle correctly, palm would go through the rounded part in the back, fingers curl over the top. If I have my hand on the handle correctly, that angle is going to take care of itself. So other consideration, how tall should the paddle be? If I use one of these here to show us the adjustable paddles, for a brand new paddler, generally I make it a little bit longer. So when I'm sizing the paddle for a brand new paddler, paddle blade goes beside the foot, same arm as that blade is on, grabs that paddle handle and takes it high. And what I'm looking for is with that hand somewhat high, I'm not reaching for the teacher, I'm not calling the teacher, so I'm not stretching. I'm just fairly relaxed, a little light bend in the elbow. I want that paddle somewheres, the paddle handle somewheres around, the meaty part of our hand. Sometimes I'll see people saying break the wrist, which is bend the wrist straight over, and that's the height that we start with. On this particular paddle, because the whole shaft will spin, I have to eyeball to make sure the paddle handle is in line with the blade, and then I lock in the height that I want. Now I mentioned that with a new paddler, I quite often start with the paddle handle a little bit on the high side. The reason for that is when we're brand new, we tend to paddle standing straight up, and we always want to have that blade all the way in the water, so a little bit more length is good. As soon as we start getting more comfortable and we're hinging over and getting a little bit nicer form, a little bit higher efficiency, too much length works against us. So often, as we become more experienced, the paddle length will shorten. So for me, I ride with my paddle somewhere around there. So we've talked about parts of the paddle. We've talked a little bit about construction. We've talked about the number of pieces of the paddle, so the different forms that you can purchase them in, fixed, 2-piece, 3-piece. We've talked about that angle of the blade and where it needs to be facing when we're holding on to it. And we've talked a little bit about how to adjust the length of the paddle. Last thing I'll mention is as we start spending a little bit more on our paddles and moving away from some of those entry-level paddles, there's some features that we want to look for. Construction is going to be the first one usually. We want something that's lighter, so it's easier on our shoulders. So we're probably looking at a carbon paddle fiber. A paddle like this one is a combination carbon shaft, poly blade, plastic blade. Plastic blade means durability. Carbon fiber shaft means we're losing a little bit of the weight. So it's kind of a happy medium. We still, if we can use it to push off of things, we can give it to friends who we know aren't great paddlers and they won't be going easy on it. Those plastic blades are super durable and last a long time. You would never do that with a full carbon blade. Push that into rocks because we might actually end up damaging the blade. So you're going to be spending a fair bit more money on a carbon fiber paddle, so you need to take a little bit more care of it. So considerations when we're looking for a new paddle are, what's the combination of materials that gives me a weight that is good for me, but also gives durability where I need it. This here is the paddle that I use all the time. So it's a full carbon. I don't take particularly good care. I'm pretty hard on my equipment, and the blade has lasted fine without any damage. But I would be cautious of when I put it on the ground. I put it on very lightly. If I'm giving it to somebody else to check the height, I always tell them to put it on their foot so they're not accidentally bashing it into the ground. You give this to kids and they're immediately going to teach it like or treat it like a shovel. They're going to be scooping stuff with it in the sand. That's just what we do. You would never do that with a blade like this. You're going to damage it. So last consideration when you're looking for your own paddle is a feature that is built generally into a little bit nicer paddles is a feature on the back here. It's called a dihedral. So I'll just move in a little bit here. We'll see if you can kind of see it there. It's a line that's running down the length of the paddle. And what that does is it changes the way the water moves off the blade. If the blade is perfectly flat, water hits it and it's going to slide. We can get some little kind of, it's not going to be smooth. It can catch the blade, it can move in different directions, and it can end up with a bit of resistance when you're trying to pull that blade through the water. What this dihedral does, this is what we're looking for, is it acts almost like the nose on a boat, where when the water comes up to it, it helps move it to the side and move it away from the blade smoothly. So we still get the power of that blade going in the water. We still get it catches a bead of water as we're moving through our power phase, but the water is sliding off the blade easier. That's going to make a big difference in efficiency. What I see most in paddles is when they don't have this, even though it might be a fairly expensive paddle that is all carbon fiber, when they're very flat, when we're going through the water, I'll hear the complaint, the paddle blade wants to kind of shimmy back and forth. It's because there's a little bit of extra resistance and that water's not moving off of it. We can work with that, a little bit tighter grip, using a little bit more muscle in the arms to hold that paddle so it doesn't want to move on you. Or we can make sure we're looking for that extra feature. All right, that's a lot of information about paddles.